Last week we talked about the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We talked about how everybody was saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And yet by the end of the week, not even that long, there were some in that crowd that were also yelling, crucify him. And we talked about how Jesus went to that cross willingly, that he was obedient to God the Father. And he did so because of glorifying God. And he glorified God even unto death on a cross. And he did that all for us. That when Jesus went on that cross, he took the sins of the world upon himself. Not just the sins of that day, but the sins of time to come and the time forever. He put all of that sin upon himself, and when he died, that sin died with him. And because of that, we are able to have a relationship with God once more. You see, up until that time, people never hoped for a relationship with God. They never had what we have. All they could do was to try and fulfill all of the various laws and ordinances. Well over 660 of them. And of course, it was not possible. If I had to follow those laws, I'd probably have to stay in bed all day. And even then, I'd probably blow a few of them. And that's how difficult it was for people at that time. They knew that they could never attain salvation on their own. And yet they would try and labor in vain. But Jesus, being on that cross, took that away. He said, you no longer have to do those things. He said, I came to set you free. And that's what he did. And so now we are seen as righteous in the eyes of God. And because of that righteousness, we can call to God in good times and in bad. And we can ask God to help us, to bless us. And God will hear those prayers, and he will answer those prayers. Maybe not as we see, but as God sees fit, he will answer. He knows exactly what we need, and he will make sure that we have all that we need. And then I told you last week that this week I would tell you the best part of that story. You see, not only being made righteous with God, and not only being able to have a relationship with God, God does something else. He puts the cherry on top of the sundae. And so I guess in the immortal words of Paul Harvey, now here's the rest of the story. These women were going to the tomb. It said they were carrying spices. Now I know a lot of us might get the idea that we probably had a jar or two of McCormick's steak rub or something. But that's not what was going on. To properly prepare a body for burial would have taken well over 100 pounds of spices. And then linens and water, sponges, and everything else. You have 3 women carrying over 100 pounds of spice, linens, water, and sponges. And on the way, they're walking through an area that is rather rocky and has a rough terrain. They are struggling. They are bearing a heavy load. And they are on the way to prepare Jesus for a burial. It is not a happy time. At least not yet. And as they struggle, and as they are weighted down by their burdens, they are talking to one another saying, wait a minute, who's going to roll that rock away? I mean, they're carrying a big load as it is. I don't think the 3 of them could have moved that rock. And yet, when they get there, that rock has already been moved. And they're wondering what's going on. One of them is brave enough to actually stoop and look in, and they see nothing. There's just some of the burial cloth laying there. And so they get brave enough and head on in. See me, stone rolled away. I look in, a body's supposed to be there, it's not. I head the other direction. They at least had the strength to go inside. And yet, when they went in, some of the Gospels tell us they were greatly perplexed. They didn't know what to do. In our Gospel lesson, it said they were terrified. Again, terrified means run the other way. They're in the middle of this tomb looking around, and it says they were terrified. They were trying to make sense of something that just wasn't possible. And yet, when the angels appear, the angels say something to them. They said, "Why are you looking for the dead or the living in the place of the dead?" And of course, they kind of try and wrap their heads around that, and before they could, the angel tells them, "Do you not remember what Jesus taught you?" And the answer obviously is no. And why is that? Well, if we remember one of the earliest encounters when Jesus revealed this to his disciples, it was on the road right after Jesus talked about Peter being the rock. Peter scored an A for that moment. And the very next second, when Jesus revealed to him, and the reason Peter got the A, by the way, was because he made that magnificent confession of faith. "You are the Lord, the Messiah." And the very next moment, Jesus said, "You are right, and that could only be revealed to you by God the Father." And then he said, "The Messiah has come into the world, and I will be killed." And before he could complete the sentence and tell them that after he is killed and be raised on the third day, Peter has to interrupt and say, "No, Lord, I won't let that happen. I know better than you." I identify with Peter. Because there's so many times in my life I say that to God. "God, help me, but I know better than you. Here's how I want you to help me." Or, "God, help me out of this situation. I shouldn't have got myself into it, but I know that I can take care of it once you get me over the hump." Many times in our lives we do that. And Peter did the same thing. And Jesus looked at Peter and he rebuked him. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." I'm not sure if I could take that, you know. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody somewhere that probably wants to say that a few times during the course of the day. But she doesn't, thankfully. But I'm sure I deserve it. And it is a rebuke that the disciples didn't hear. They also didn't hear Jesus telling them time and time again that yes, he was going to the cross. Yes, he was going to die. But on the third day, God would raise him from the dead. That's the part they kept missing. It's the part they didn't want to listen to because they did not want their Messiah to die. They did not understand what we understand. If they would have, when they went to the tomb, these women who had been his followers, his disciples, they would have understood what went on. But with all of the things that had happened in those past 3 days, it just seemed like there was no hope. And it seemed like the burden of what they were carrying was crushing them. And it wasn't even so much the weight of the spices and the linens and the water and the sponges, but I think it was the weight of the world that was upon them. Because everything that they had hoped for had been taken from them. That everything they had heard, they believed in, it seemed like it was over. That Jesus was no longer there, and therefore their lives were empty. And yet, when they got to the tomb, that's exactly what they found. Emptiness. because God had raised Jesus from the dead. And that is the cherry on top of the sundae. Because we know that those who believe in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, as we are baptized into the faith, we are baptized into a life like Christ, so too we are baptized in a death like His, and so it is we are baptized into a resurrection like His. We no longer have to fear death. That this life we live here on earth, we do so to the glory of God. Not because we have to. We don't have to jump through the hoops. We don't have to cover all the bases. We don't have to follow all of those laws. Rather, we can live to glorify God. And how do we do that? Well, Jesus told us to love one another as I have loved you. And the way He showed His love was by serving His disciples. He went about doing the job of a slave when He washed their feet. And Jesus said, do as I do to you. And so God says that if you want to glorify me, then go to the least of all people and serve them. That those people that we as a society want to push away, those people who we judge as being unfit, those people who we see in our eyes as maybe being unimportant, God says they are the most important. They are the ones we should welcome into society. Those are the folks whom we should open our arms to, just as Christ did on the cross. And when we do that, we glorify God. But we do not earn our salvation by doing that. It's kind of like this. My dad and I had a very interesting relationship. Most of the things I did after my mom passed away, I did out of obligation. It was a sense of duty. I was the only son left in Erie. The other two moved away. So, guess who got to deal with Dad? But I did most everything I did because I thought it was my duty as a son to do. I wish it would have been because I loved my father and I wanted to do it for him. You see, that's the difference. With God, we don't have an obligation. What we do out of love. And that's the difference. That's the difference that relationship with God makes. That's the difference between having to follow commandments and loving God and fulfilling the commandment of Jesus to love others as I have loved you. And when we do that, and we understand that, we understand that we are free from the bondage of our sin, we are free even from death itself, that the grave is no longer the end, but it is the beginning. That as we come to a graveside, we no longer have to be afraid. We no longer have to worry about what comes next. Because God says, just as I have raised my son, I shall raise you. And not only just as I have raised my son will I raise you, but you are now heirs to my kingdom. That even though on the day of judgment, when Jesus comes again on the clouds with his angels and the trumpet sounds, it says the graves will be opened and the dead shall rise first, and those who are still living on this earth shall then rise with them. And then it is judgment day. And every one of us will be judged as guilty. But because of the grace of God in Jesus Christ dying on that cross, he will say, you have been paid for by the blood of my son. All those who believe, you have been paid for. And then he will say something that we've been waiting to hear all of our lives. Welcome into my kingdom. You see, it's something we don't have to earn. It's something we can earn. God gave us everything on the cross and with that empty tomb. And that's why we celebrate today. That's why we dress up in our finest clothes and we put all these flowers around that makes the pastor's nose run and start making me cough. And when you're at Trinity with me, they put them all in front of the altar so that I can't get away from those things. And that's why we do it. To celebrate, to rejoice, knowing that God has given us everything and then He gives us more. And that's what we celebrate. And that's what we can celebrate each and every day the rest of our lives. That love of God that we cannot understand, the mystery of God that we can never fully know, and yet we can celebrate God as the one who came into the world to save it, so that all who believe in Him shall not perish. That we, trusting in God, as sinful as we might be, we know that we are redeemed by that same God. That is the cherry on top. That is the gift that God gives us. That is worth celebrating. Amen. Amen.